In the winter of 1733, London held more than 500,000 people inside its borders. It was loud, crowded, and perpetually dirty. The Thames carried its filth east toward the sea. The streets were narrow and poorly lit. Entire families shared single rooms. The wealthy lived behind locked doors and employed others to manage everything they touched. The poor did the managing. There was no police force. Order was kept loosely by parish constables and night watchmen who were themselves often drunk, corrupt, or simply absent. When crimes occurred, justice moved quickly and brutally. Trials lasted hours, not weeks. A guilty verdict meant death in most serious cases, and the hangings were public. Crowds gathered at Tyburn and other designated sites to watch. It was considered entertainment. It was considered instruction. London in 1733 was a city where one's position in life was almost entirely fixed at birth, and where crossing the invisible line between servitude and crime carried consequences that were absolute and irreversible. This is the world Sarah Malcolm was born into, and the world that would eventually kill her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Malcolm was born in Ireland, most likely around 1710 or 1711. The exact date is not recorded, neither are most of the details of her early life. What is known comes largely from the trial that ended it. She was described in contemporary accounts as educated and from a respectable family, though what that respectability amounted to in material terms is unclear. At some point in her youth, she moved to London. By the early 1730s, she was working as a laundress. The work involved washing and mending clothing for the gentlemen who occupied chambers in the Inns of Court. This was physically exhausting labor. She would collect soiled linen, carry it back to her lodgings near Shoreditch in the north of the city, wash it by hand, and return it pressed and folded. She was paid very little for this. She had no fixed employer, no security, and no safety net. She was approximately 22 years old, unmarried, and living alone in rented rooms far from everyone she had grown up knowing. Among the clients she served was a Mr. John Carroll, a gentleman with chambers in the Inner Temple. She had also performed chair work, a form of general domestic labor, for other residents of the temple on various occasions. One of those residents was a woman named Lydia Dunham. Mrs. Dunham was a widow of approximately 80 years old. She had lived in the same apartments in Tanfield Court for 4 decades, 4 flights of stairs above the street. Her late husband had left her a modest fortune. She did not spend extravagantly. She lived quietly, received visitors occasionally, and kept her affairs in careful order. She employed 2 servants. The older one was Elizabeth Harrison, who had been with her for many years. Elizabeth was around 60 years old and in failing health, but Mrs. Dunham had kept her on out of loyalty. The younger servant was Anne Price, a girl of 17 who had been hired 3 months earlier to perform the heavier tasks Elizabeth could no longer manage. Later, it was a small, still household. 3 women at different stages of life, living in close quarters inside a building full of lawyers and scholars. Mrs. Dunham kept her money in a strong black box in her chamber. The key to that box was held not by her, but by a trusted friend named Mrs. Frances Rymer, who also served as her executrix. This arrangement was known to anyone who spent time in the household. Sarah Malcolm had spent time in that household. She had been employed as a chairwoman for Mrs. Dunham until shortly before Christmas in 1732. She had been inside those rooms many times. She knew the layout. She knew the routines. She knew where the money was kept. By early February of 1733, Sarah Malcolm was no longer working for Mrs. Dunham, but she had not forgotten what she had learned there. On the evening of Saturday, February 3rd, 1733, Sarah Malcolm arrived at Mrs. Dunham's chambers at approximately 8 in the evening. She said she had come to inquire about the health of Elizabeth Harrison. Another woman, Mrs. Ann Oliphant, who worked as a laundress for a Mr. Grizzly, whose chambers were directly opposite, happened to be visiting at the same time. The 2 women spoke briefly with Mrs. Dunham and with Elizabeth Harrison, then left together shortly before 9. A third visitor, Mrs. Ann Love, stayed on for another quarter of an hour before departing. The door was secured behind her. It had a spring lock and a bolt on the inside. The following afternoon was Sunday, February 4th. Mrs. Ann Love returned at 1 o'clock. She had been invited to dine. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She went downstairs. I asked whether anyone had seen the servants and was told no one had. She returned to the door. She knocked a third time. She began to form theories. Perhaps Elizabeth Harrison had died during the night. Perhaps Anne Price had gone to inform her family. She went to fetch Mrs. Frances Reimer, who lived nearby. Together they knocked again. When no response came, they asked Mrs. Oliphant for help. Mrs. Oliphant suggested something unusual. Mr. Grizzly had left his chambers earlier that week. She had been given his keys. She offered to climb out of his window, cross the gutter along the roof leads, break a pane of glass in Mrs. Dunham's window, and enter that way. It was an extraordinary thing to suggest, but the two women agreed. Something felt wrong. Mrs. Oliphant climbed out onto the leads, broke the glass, opened the casement. Ison stepped inside. She crossed the room to the door. It was locked and bolted from the inside. She slid the bolt open and let the others in. In the passage near the entrance, they found Anne Price. She was lying on her bed. Her throat had been cut from one side to the other. Her hands were clenched. Her hair had fallen over her face. There was blood everywhere. In the next room, they found Elizabeth Harrison on the press bed. She had been strangled. There were marks of scratching around her throat. In the adjoining chamber lay Mrs. Lydia Dunham across her bed. She had also been strangled. The strong black box had been forced open. Everything inside was gone. The alarm was raised immediately. Constables and watchmen arrived. A crowd gathered on the stairs and in the court below. The chambers were examined carefully, and there was no sign of forced entry other than the window Mrs. Oliphant had broken herself. The door had been bolted from the inside. The staircase windows had recently been barred. The only remaining possibility was that someone had entered through Mr. Grizzly's chambers, using the weak lock that Mrs. Oliphant herself had described as easily picked. 3 women were dead. The money was gone, and whoever had done it had apparently walked out and left the door sealed behind them. Investigators began working through the list of people who had recently had access to Mrs. Dunham's household: laundresses, chairwomen, tradespeople, regular visitors. The questions were methodical. The answers at first were not particularly useful. On the same Sunday morning that the bodies were being discovered 4 flights above Tanfield Court, Sarah Malcolm arrived at Mr. Carroll's chambers at approximately 9. Mr. Carroll and a friend, Mr. John Gagan, were breakfasting together. Sarah Malcolm made tea for them and moved about the chambers, doing her work. She stayed until the horn sounded for commons, around 1 in the afternoon, then left. Mr. Carroll and Mr. Gagan went out. At some point during their walk through Tanfield Court, they heard about the murders. They went to a coffee house in Covent Garden, where the details were already being discussed and debated. The general theory circulating was that the crime had been committed by someone familiar with the household, likely a laundress or a servant. The 2 men spent the evening at a tavern on Essex Street and did not return until well past midnight. When Mr. Carroll entered his chambers, he found Sarah Malcolm still there. The door was open. A fire was burning. A candle was lit. It was after 1 in the morning. He was surprised to see her. He asked whether anyone had been arrested in connection with the murders. She told him no, but that a gentleman with chambers below Mrs. Dunham's had been absent for several days and was under suspicion. Mr. Carroll told her plainly that he would not continue to employ anyone who had been acquainted with Mrs. Dunham's household until the murderer was identified. He told her to gather her things and leave. He then began to examine his belongings and noticed almost immediately that several of his waistcoats were missing. He asked about them. She hesitated, then asked to speak with him privately. He refused. And she admitted she had pawned them at a shop in Drury Lane for 2 guineas and asked him not to be angry. He told her he was less concerned about the waistcoats than about his growing suspicion that she was connected to what had happened in Tanfield Court. He noticed a bundle on the floor of the closet. He asked what it was. She said it was an old gown containing a shift and an apron, and that these were not proper for a man to see. He did not open it then. He instructed the watchman, who had been brought in by this point, to take her to the watchhouse. She was led away. After she was gone, Mr. Carroll and Mr. Gagan searched the chambers more carefully. Under the bed, they found another bundle. Inside the close stool, they found more linen and a silver tankard. The handle of the tankard was bloody, or they went immediately to find the watchman. One informed them that he had released Sarah Malcolm on her promise to return at 10 the following morning. Mr. Carroll told him to find her at once. The watchman went to the temple gate and found her sitting with two other watchmen. She was brought back. Mr. Carroll showed her the tankard. He asked if it was hers. She said yes, that her mother had left it to her. He asked about the blood on the handle. She showed him a small cut on her finger and said she had wounded herself. He asked about the linen. She said the staining was not blood, but the marks of a personal disorder. She was taken to the watch house and searched. In her clothing, pressed against her body, they found a green silk purse containing 21 gold counters. Sarah Malcolm was brought before an alderman named Brocas. The tankard was examined and identified by Mrs. Frances Reimer as the same one that Mrs. Dunham had used to store her money, kept locked inside the black box. The linen was identified as belonging to Mrs. Dunham. The shift and apron that had been folded inside the gown were heavily stained with blood. A case knife with a white handle and a broken blade had been found on the table in Mrs. Dunham's chambers. The blade itself had not yet been located. Sarah Malcolm was charged with 3 counts of murder and with robbery. Her trial was set for Friday, February 23, 1733, at the Old Bailey. In the days between her arrest and her trial, she made statements to the authorities. She admitted involvement in the robbery. She denied the murders entirely. She said she had been used as a lookout, posted on the stairs while others went inside. And the murders, she said, had been committed by a woman named Mary Tracy and 2 brothers named James and Thomas Alexander. She described how the plan had come together, how they had entered the chambers, and how the crime had unfolded. She said she had heard nothing from her position on the stairs. She said she had been given a portion of the stolen goods afterward, the linen and the tankard, as her share. She said she had not known anyone was dead until Sunday afternoon. Investigators searched for Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers. They found nothing. No one by those names could be located. No evidence of their involvement or their existence surfaced. The authorities concluded that Sarah Malcolm had invented them to redirect blame. She maintained they were real. On the morning of February 23, 1733, Sarah Malcolm was brought to the bar at the Old Bailey at 10 o'clock. The courtroom was full. The case had drawn considerable attention. A young woman accused of killing 3 people, including an elderly widow and a teenage girl. Inside one of the most secure and prestigious legal addresses in London was not an ordinary case. The indictments were read. She was charged with the murder of Anne Price by cutting her throat, the murder of Elizabeth Harrison by strangling her with a cord, the murder of Lydia Dunham by strangling her with a cord. She was additionally charged on the coroner's inquisition with breaking into the dwelling house of Lydia Dunham and stealing money, a silver tankard, a canvas bag, and linen. She pleaded not guilty to every charge. The prosecution announced it would proceed first with the charge of murdering Anne Price. If the jury convicted on that count, it would not pursue the others. A jury of 12 men was sworn. Counsel for the prosecution opened methodically. He laid out the circumstances: an elderly widow of modest fortune, 2 loyal servants, a former employee who had worked in the household and knew precisely where the money was kept. He described what had been found in the chambers on Sunday afternoon and what had been found in Mr. Carroll's rooms later that night. He told the jury that the evidence would demonstrate guilt beyond any reasonable interpretation. Mr. John Carroll testified first. He described finding Sarah Malcolm in his chambers after midnight, the discovery of the hidden linen, and the bloody tankard. As he described how she had initially claimed the items as her own and how they had since been identified as Mrs. Dunham's property. Sarah Malcolm questioned him. She insisted that on Sunday morning he had watched her count a sum of £90 in his own bed and had asked where she had gotten it, and that she had told him it came from relations in the country. Mr. Carroll denied this firmly and repeatedly. He said that if he had seen her with £90, he would have been suspicious the moment he heard about the murders and would have returned home immediately. The exchange became increasingly heated. The court moved it along. Mr. John Gagan corroborated Carroll's account in full. He described the discovery of the bloody tankard and said that when he first saw it, he had been furious and had called Sarah Malcolm a name that was recorded in the transcript, but which the court did not dwell on. He said she had attempted to wipe the blood from the handle before he could stop her. He said the blood had appeared fresh to him. Sarah Malcolm challenged him on this point. She asked whether the blood had been wet or dry. He said he believed it was wet. She pointed out that if it had been wet at that moment, the linen that had been folded around it for more than 24 hours would still be damp. The court noted that blood dries at varying rates depending on conditions and moved on. The two watchmen, John Master and Richard Hughes, testified about searching the chambers and finding the linen. Hughes said he had unfolded the shift and apron and confirmed the staining. When asked whether the blood was wet or dry, he said he could not be certain. Sarah Malcolm pressed him on this. She said it was difficult to believe a man could handle bloodied cloth and be unable to say whether it was wet. He had no firm answer. Mrs. Ann Love testified about arriving on Sunday afternoon, finding the door unanswered, and arranging for the entry through the window. She described the state of the chambers in careful detail. She also said she had encountered Sarah Malcolm that same afternoon near the Bishop of Bangor's door and had asked her to help find a smith to open Mrs. Dunham's door. Sarah Malcolm had gone, but returned without one. Mrs. Oliphant testified about Saturday evening and about the climb through the window on Sunday. She confirmed that the door had been bolted from the inside when she entered. She said there was no obvious means by which a person could exit the chambers and leave the bolt in place. She suggested again that Mr. Grizzly's door had a weak lock that could have been picked. Mrs. Frances Reimer testified about the tankard. She said she had opened Mrs. Dunham's box the Thursday before the murders. Inside, she had found a bag containing approximately 20 guineas, several parcels sealed with black wax, each holding 2 or 3 guineas, a parcel of 20 guineas set aside for burial expenses, and another of 18 intended as mourning gifts. All of it had been kept inside the tankard, which had been inside the locked box. The box had been forced open. The tankard was empty. She identified the silk purse found in Sarah Malcolm's clothing as resembling one she had seen in Mrs. Dunham's possession. Mrs. Frances Crowder testified that she recognized the tankard. She said Mrs. Dunham had shown it to her approximately 5 years earlier and described her attachment to it. She also examined the shifts found in Mr. Carroll's chambers. She said Mrs. Dunham's linen was cut in a particular way that she recognized, and she produced one of Mrs. Dunham's shifts to demonstrate the resemblance. The court noted it. The prosecution rested on a foundation that was entirely circumstantial but dense and consistent. Sarah Malcolm had been in Mrs. Dunham's chambers the night before the murders. She had been found in possession of Mrs. Dunham's property. She had lied about it when confronted. She had tried to wipe away the blood. She had been discovered in her employer's rooms at 1 in the morning with no credible explanation. A green silk purse matching one belonging to the deceased had been hidden on her body. No witness had seen her kill anyone. No weapon had been found in her possession. No blood had been found on her clothing when she was arrested more than 24 hours after the crime. But the prosecution argued that each of these gaps could be explained, and that taken together, the evidence pointed to only one conclusion. Sarah Malcolm was permitted to present her own defense. She had no barrister. She spoke for herself. She said again, firmly, that she had not committed the murders. She had been involved in the robbery. She admitted that openly, but only as a lookout on the staircase. The plan had been organized by Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers. They had entered the chambers. She had waited outside. She had heard nothing. Afterward, and they had divided the stolen goods among themselves. Her share had been the linen and the tankard. She had hidden them in Mr. Carroll's chambers because she had nowhere else to secure them. She had not known anyone was dead until Sunday afternoon, at which point she had panicked and made poor decisions. The prosecution asked why, if she was innocent of murder, she had not gone immediately to the authorities when she learned of the crime. She said she had been afraid because she had participated in the robbery and knew that would be used against her regardless of what she said about the rest. They asked why no trace of her 3 alleged accomplices could be found. She said she did not know. They asked how the door had been bolted from the inside with no one remaining in the chambers. She said Mary Tracy must have found a way to manage it. The court found this unsatisfying. The judge summed up carefully. He reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay with the prosecution. He explained that a conviction could rest on circumstantial evidence if the jury was satisfied to the required standard. He noted that Sarah Malcolm's own admissions placed her at the scene the night before the murders, that stolen property had been found in her possession, that she had lied about it, and that no credible alternative explanation had been established. He told the jury to weigh everything and decide according to their conscience. The jury retired. They returned quickly. The foreman announced the verdict. Guilty. Sarah Malcolm did not visibly react. She stood in the dock without expression. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentence was passed. She said she was innocent of murder. She said she had told the truth. She said Mary Tracy and the Alexanders were guilty. The judge placed the black cap on his head and sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out on Wednesday, March 7, 1733. She was returned to Newgate Prison. She received visits from clergymen. She continued to insist on her version of events. The authorities continued to search for Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers. They found nothing. Among the visitors who came to Newgate in the days before her execution was the artist William Hogarth. He arrived on March 5th, 2 days before she was to die. He sat with her and sketched her in her cell. She sat quietly in a white cap and dark dress, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. Hogarth worked in silence. What he produced was not dramatic. It was not designed to horrify or to provoke sympathy. It showed a young woman sitting still, waiting. Her face gave almost nothing away. He later completed a painting from the sketch and produced an engraving from that. Both circulated widely. Her image became more famous than her name. On Wednesday, March the 7th, 1733, Sarah Malcolm was executed. The location was chosen deliberately. A gallows was erected in Fleet Street near the Temple, close to where the crimes had been committed, rather than at Tyburn where most London executions took place. The authorities wanted the people who lived and worked in the legal district to see it. They wanted the message to be specific and local. She was brought from Newgate in a cart, accompanied by the Reverend Mr. Piddington, curate of St. Bartholomew the Great. She was pale. She did not speak to the crowd. She mounted the scaffold without visible distress. The rope was placed around her neck. A cap was pulled over her face. The cart moved and she was left hanging. Her body remained on the gallows for a period before it was taken down, as was customary. She was buried, though no record of the location survived. The newspapers covered it. The Gentleman's Magazine published an account of the trial and the execution. The details were discussed in coffee houses and in print. The case was understood primarily as a warning about the dangers of allowing domestic workers access to one's home and valuables. It was cited as proof that the justice system functioned, that criminals were identified and punished. Some voices were quieter and more uncertain. They noted that the evidence had been entirely circumstantial, where that no one had seen her commit any act of violence, that no weapon had been found in her possession, that no blood had been found on her body or clothing when she was arrested more than a day after the killings. They noted that her story, while difficult to verify, had never been conclusively destroyed. These doubts were noted and then largely set aside. Mary Tracy and the Alexander brothers were never found. No charges were ever brought against anyone else. The case was formally closed with Sarah Malcolm's death. The 3 women who died in Tanfield Court on the night of February 3rd into February 4th, 1733, are not well remembered individually. Lydia Dunham had lived 80 years. She had managed her own affairs, maintained her independence, and treated the people who served her with genuine care. Honey Elizabeth Harrison had worked for her for decades, kept on past the point of usefulness, because Mrs. Dunham valued loyalty over efficiency. Anne Price had been in service for 3 months. She was 17. She had come from somewhere outside London. She had been in the city barely long enough to learn her way around. All 3 were killed in a single night for a sum of money that was never recovered. If Sarah Malcolm had been telling the truth, that money was taken by 3 people who escaped London and disappeared into wherever people disappeared to in 1733. If she had been lying, the money was hidden or spent or scattered, and its fate was never determined. Hogarth's portrait of Sarah Malcolm is today held in the collection of the National Galleries of Scotland. It is considered one of his more direct and unsentimental works. He made no attempt to render her monstrous or pitiable. He showed what he saw, a young woman in a cell, facing death, giving nothing away. The painting has outlasted almost everything else connected to the case. The trial transcript survives in the records of the Old Bailey. It was published at the time as part of the proceedings of the sessions, which were printed and sold to the public. These documents form one of the most detailed records of criminal justice in 18th century England. They preserve not only verdicts and sentences, but the actual language of defendants speaking in their own voices, questioning witnesses, insisting on their own versions of events in rooms that had already decided against them. Sarah Malcolm's section of the transcript is notable for exactly that. She questioned every witness who testified against her. She pressed them on details. She challenged the state of the blood. She challenged Mr. Carroll's denial about the money. She was persistent and specific in a room that was not designed to give her a fair hearing, in a system that had already weighted the outcome before she opened her mouth. Whether that persistence reflected the desperation of a guilty woman trying to create doubt, or an innocent one trying to survive a proceeding that had turned against her, is a question the record cannot answer. What is certain is that she died for it. The Inner Temple still stands. It is still one of the four inns of court. It still trains barristers and houses the institutions of English law. Tanfield Court no longer exists in its original form. The buildings have been reconstructed over the centuries. Fleet Street is still there, always still a major road through the center of the city, though the newspaper industry that once defined it has been gone for decades. The site of the gallows where Sarah Malcolm was hanged is not marked. Newgate Prison, where she spent her last weeks, was demolished at the start of the 20th century. The Old Bailey, the central criminal court for London, was built on that same ground. It is still operating today. The case of Sarah Malcolm belongs to a London that was already beginning to dissolve even as she died in it. The public execution, the brief trial, the defendant with no counsel speaking alone against a room of professionals. The gallows erected at a particular street corner to send a message to a particular neighborhood. These were features of a world that would slowly change over the following century, replaced by something more systematic and more private, if not always more just. The questions the case raises have not been answered in the 300 years since. Whether Sarah Malcolm killed 3 women in the Inner Temple, or whether she robbed them through others and arrived at the gallows for a crime she did not personally commit, cannot be established from what survives. The evidence was consistent with guilt. It was not conclusive of it. The jury decided in less than an hour. What remains is this. On the morning of Sunday, February 4th, 1733, 3 women were found dead in their rooms in Tanfield Court. A 22-year-old laundress was arrested the following night with their property hidden in her employer's chambers. She was tried on the 23rd of February, convicted the same day, and executed on the 7th of March. She died maintaining that others had done the killing. Those others, if they existed, were never found. The Hogarth portrait remains. The trial transcript remains. The 3 women in Tanfield Court remain, in the record, if not in memory. Everything else has been rebuilt.